In the Mishnah on Yudalid Amid Aleph, that means on 14a, we have brought two very Chanina Sagana Kahanim said. We don't have, in the days of the Kahanim, in the days of the Beis Hamikdash, we burnt together meat that was a Rishon, meaning that it had touched an Av HaTumah. An Av HaTumah, once again, is mostly coming out of people who have seen bodily emissions, or a dead, one of the 8 shiratzim, one of the 8 creepy crawly dead. That more or less is the situation. The piece of meat touched an Ava Tumah, it became a Rishon Tumah. And we said, and Rav Chanina said, we can burn it together with something, with a piece of meat that had touched a Rishon, meaning a piece of meat that touches a Rishon is either a Sheni, or if it touches a Sheni, becomes a Shalishi, and so on. And if it's Kachim, it can go all the way down to a 4th level, which would be a Revi, to the 4th level. So we said a first level, a Rishon level of meat can be burnt together with a 2, 3, or 4, a Sheni, Shlishi, or Revi level of meat, even though that level of meat at that time in the Meretz, we said, will then rise because by dint of touching a Rishon, it will rise up from a Shalishi to a Sheni, or from a Revi to a Shalishi. It will automatically go up to a Sheni, because anything that touches a Rishon by definition becomes a Sheni. And that was Rabbi Chanina's Kahanim that said we have no problem burning those together. Rabbi Akiva came along and added, and he said as follows: I'll give you even a more interesting case. If I have oil of teruma, which is tahar, which was touched by a tvul yom. A tvul yom is somebody who finished his contaminated days, went to the mikvah, he toivel, he's a tvul yom, but he still has to wait for harish shemesh. He still has to wait for the nighttime until he's allowed to eat teruma. And in between the time that he went to the mikvah to the time nightfall fell, he touched teruma. Minat Torah, the teruma became a shalishi letuma, which is to say, a teruma on a shalishi letuma, it itself is tuma, is contaminated, but it no longer can convey tuma any further. It cannot convey tuma any further. That's as far as it can go. Okay, so that meant you now have something on the 3rd level, a pasul, meaning it is tuma itself, but can no longer convey tumah further, which is now being burned together with a first level, a rishon of basar, of meat. Obviously, when that shalishi touches the rishon, it bumps all the way up, right? He says you still can do it. From this, Rameir came along and said the following words: Amar Rameir, words, Lamadatu Sesarfin Teruma Tahira into you're allowed to burn together. You're allowed to burn together. That's tahar of chametz together with the.
1 second. Everybody needs to mute themselves.
Somebody is off mute. It's just making it. Anyway, so the point of it is that those cases seem to be analogous to our case over here, that I'm allowed to burn on Erev Pesach the truma that is tahar together with the truma that is tameh, in the same way that over there you were able to bump up teruma from a 3rd level to a 2nd level, or from a 4th level to a 3rd level, or a 2nd level with regard to kachim. So this is where we're up to on Yudalit on the base. Amar Rameir Midivrei Lamnu, that you're allowed to burn the chametz together, the chametz stick of truma that's tar together with the chametz stick of truma that is pasul. Again, truma that is tar has to be watched. Remember, there's the pasuk says, "Vani hinei nesati l'chez mishmeret shmuasai." Behold, I have given you the safeguard of my trumas. That is a mitzvah. I say that you have to watch truma. So, frag the Gemara, zok the Gemara, midavrei and deman. Who are we talking about? Elaim, if you want to say me the Vrayim, Rabbi Chanina Sigan Kahanim, that Rameir is saying that I'm allowed to burn the two chametzis together, the Tameh and the Torah of Truma. We learn it out of the words of Rabbi Chanina Sigan Kahanim, me dummy. It doesn't work. It's not analogous. Some Tameh v'Tameh. Because in the case of Rabbi Chanina's case, the first piece of meat is a rishon by having touched an abatoma. The second piece of meat is either a sheni or a shalishi, or if it's or a revi. Either way, they're tamei. If you're dealing with meat that were tamei on a first level and meat that was tamei either on a second or a third level, the worst that can happen is that it jumps up by the meat touching the first might become a second. So what are you dealing with? Hosam tamei v'tamei. You're dealing with two pieces of meat that are both contaminated. Hacha, in our case on Erev Pesach, yes, one of the trumas, the chametz sticket trumas that we're trying to burn is tamei, but the other chametz sticket truma that we're coming to burn is tahar, is uncontaminated, is pure. So now you're dealing with, you want to take pure truma and you want to contaminate it by burning it together with the tamei truma chametz. That is not analogous to Reb Chanina Sagan Kahanim, because by Reb Chanina Sagan Kahanim, when he's talking about burning kachim together, he's talking about two tamei kachim, one on the first level, one on a second or third level. Yes, it bumps up, but they still start life both tamei. It's completely different. So it says the element to be Rabbi Akiva. Maybe you want to talk about Rabbi Akiva, because what in Rabbi Akiva's case is the oil really is tahar, but it was touched by a tful yain, and minat Torah became a shalishi. It became a third level. What is the third level by truma? That's it. Meaning the truma itself is tamei, inherently tamei within itself, but can no longer has the power to convey tamei down the road. So it is a psul. So what happens in the case of Rabbi Akiva when that oil touches the metal lamp, which, as we learned on last Amid, which if it's a metal lamp, it is tamei on the level of an avatuma. Metal that touches an avatuma remains an avatuma. From the pasuk that says, if a sword stabs a man, and from there we learned that metal takes on the same level as the man himself, which is an avatuma. It doesn't drop down. The normal case is when something touches an avatuma, it drops down one level to a first level, to a rishon. Here by metal, it stays on the same level. So the shlishi of truma, which was touched by a tful yain, touches the avatuma, that is the lamp. So that means the risha, that the shlishi l'tuma becomes a rishon l'tuma. The third level truma now becomes a first level. So yes, it bumps up from a psul, from a third level, which means it's only tamei itself, but can no longer convey tuma, to a first level, which means it is tuma and could convey further down to a sheni or a shlishi. So we said yes, that's true. But midami has some psul v'tamei. The case of Rabbi Akiva is where it starts off life as a psul, it is tamei, as a shalishi, as a third level truma, which means it is tamei and it cannot convey. And yes, now it becomes a tuma that not only is it tamei but could also convey. But that's still different than our case. At least you're still dealing with two tamei things. Yes, you were dealing with a low-level tamei. You were dealing with the tamei. That was low level. Okay, you were definitely dealing with a tamei that was low level. Now you're raising it, but it was still tamei to tamei. So there is no comparison. So Zakti Gemara, you're right. Nema Kesav Rameh. Maybe we've got the wrong thing. When Rameh said Midivrei Lamdu, maybe we're saying like this: that Reb Chanina's case. We've been saying till now that Rabbi Chanina's case is where a meat that's on the level of a rishon because it touched an avatuma was now burned together with meat that was either on a second, third, or fourth level. Biblically, let's switch the case. Masnisin ba'avatuma di'oraisa. You're right. one piece of meat is a rishon because it became tameh by touching an avatuma, which made it into a rishon. But the second piece of meat, velad hatuma derabonon, is a velad hatuma rabbinically. The truth is, the second piece, biblically speaking, is completely tahar. It is not tahar. The tameh, the contamination that it has, is only on the rabbinical level. What's the story? As we know, as we learned in the introduction on yesterday's daf, Adam v'kelim, people and utensils, which includes clothes, can only go down to the first level, can only be mitama on the rishon, on the first level. That's it. They have no more power to go to be mitama things on the second, third, and fourth level. They can only be mitama on the first thing, which means how do they become tameh? How does a person and utensil become tameh? Right? Very simple, by having touched an avatuma. Well, what is an avatuma? And we said it before. An avatuma is about a person. A person sees bodily emissions, whether it's a zav, a zava, a mitzayra, right? A woman who gave birth, or yoledes, or it's touched one of the 8 creepy, crawly dead shiratzim, one of the eight creepy, crawly lizards, etc. That means, however, that food and drink, specifically in this case, drink, is not an avatuma, which means that a person and utensils, which can only be on level 1 on a rishon, which means that it has to be mitama, it has to become contaminated by dint of touching an av hatuma. And since food and drink, maichel umishte, food and liquid, cannot be on the first, cannot be an avatuma, it means that food and liquids can never, biblically speaking, have the power to be mitama, to contaminate a person and utensils. Comes along the Chachamim and says, since liquids on some level look like bodily emissions of human beings, rabbinically speaking, we are going to say that if liquid that is tameh, that is contaminated, touches a utensil, touches a kli, it takes on rabbinical contamination on level 2. If liquids are again tameh and they touch a utensil, only midiaraisa, the utensil is perfectly fine. Rabbinically speaking, it takes on a tuma, a sheni letuma, a second level tuma, which means midirabanan, rabbinically, which means that if that utensil now touches one of our meats over here, the meat will become a third level tuma, shlishi letuma midirabanan, a third level tuma rabbinically only. So maybe the case, says the Gemara, with the big fig over here, the first piece of meat is definitely a diaraisa, a biblical first level tuma, because it touched an avatuma. The second piece is no more than a third level rabbinical, a rabbinical third level tome. And by putting them together to burn them together, the third level rabbinical, the rabbinical third level tame, because it was touched by a utensil that was touched by contaminated liquids. Contaminated liquids, midiaraisa, is not mitama anything, does not contaminate anything, does not contaminate vessels, does not contaminate utensils, but rabbinically, the contaminated liquids touched, the contaminated liquids does have the power rabbinically to turn the utensil into a second level dirabanan. By dint of that, it touched the meat, which became a third level dirabanan. This third level dirabanan, third level rabbinical, touches a first level meat, together when they burn it together becomes a second level. It jumps up to a second level rabbinical contamination by touching the rishon, which is definitely tomei midiraisa, the shlishi l'tumah midirabanan, the third level tomei rabbinically jumps up to a second level tomei rabbinically. That's what Rabbi Chanina Sagan Khan's case is. And you can't say that this third level rabbinic becomes a second level biblically because it touched the first level tumah biblically, because yesterday we all learned that ein machol metama meichel. Food does not contaminate food down the line. We learned this yesterday. Food does not contaminate food. Well, if food doesn't contaminate food, which means biblically speaking, when the third level rabbinic touched the first level biblically, nothing happens to it because food cannot contaminate food. Rabbinically, we say that the third level rabbinic, by touching the first level biblical, becomes a second level rabbinic. You see, it could jump up. Now, by chametz, and now we're on top of Tezvav. Jerry, we're on your daf. Umay divrayim midivrei Reb Chanina Sagan Kahanim. If this is what Reb Chanina Sagan Kahanim is talking about, so that means now by chametz on the 6th hour, in the 6th hour, we have to burn the chametz, and we're forbidden from eating the chametz only rabbinically. The biblical, it gets forbidden biblically only on the 7th hour, since we're dealing in the 6th hour, which is only rabbinic. And you see over here that you're allowed to bump up a third level rabbinic into a second level rabbinic. So to over here, you can put the chametz, which needs to be burnt, even though it's tahar, it's non-contaminated. Hi, Isaac, a non-contaminated truma together with contaminated truma chametz. It's okay because we're dealing at a rabbinic level. This is the big thumb. So right away the Gemara says, Amarei Shagim Shumak Kapara. That's very nice. You want to shoehorn this rabbinic, it's touching the thing, all thing. That's not what Reb Chanina Sagan Kahanim said. Look at the Mishnah. That's not what he said. Masnisim ba'avatuma. Our Mishnah is talking about when one meat became contaminated on the as a rishon because it touched an avatuma. Velad atuma di'araisa, and the second meat became tamei midi'araisa by touching a first level or a second level. It's either tamei on the second or third or fourth level. Don't bring in the rabbanon's rabbinical that it's got that a utensil got touched by a rabbinic got touched by Talmudic liquids, and so rabbinic becomes a second, which then turns this into a rabbinic third, that flows back into a rabbinic second, and so this is now this is our case because we're burning the chametz in the 6th hour, which is only rabbinic and not biblical. It's not the case, so this doesn't make any sense. But if that's the case, that it's a fact that Reb Chanina Sagan Kahanim is talking about a biblical tameh on a first level, and the second meat is biblically tameh either on a second or a third or fourth level, then it's certainly not analogous to our case, because over there in the Mishnah, both pieces of meat are tameh. Here by the chametz, one half of the chametz is tahar, is pure, uncontaminated truma chametz. So it's not a comparison. Here we have tar to tameh. There we have tameh to tameh. Tameh to tameh you can burn together. Tar to tameh, maybe I can't. So therefore, what is the words umay divrayim? When Rameir said umay divrayim, elamai, he must be talking about midivrei Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. He must be talking about the words of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Because if you look in the Mishnah, because Rabbi Yossi, right after Rameir says you're allowed to burn both of them together, Amar Rabbi Yossi, eino hu min amida. It's not analogous. Umaydim Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua Umaydim, that you burn each one separately, you need 2 separate fires. So we're going to say, from those, if you roll it back, Rameir must be talking about Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. What's the case of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua? Hi, Rabbi Yeshua, which case of Rabbi Yeshua is Rameir deriving from? Ilay Mahadar Rabbi Yeshua. If you want to say it's the following teaching of Rabbi Yeshua, it's not because we learned Chav is shel teruma shenoided loy suffix tuma, a cask of wine that is truma, all of a sudden became questionable. It was tahar. And as Rashi says, Kigoin, for an example, Shenichnas Adam Tomei Lisham, a Tomadika person, a contaminated person came into the where the wine is being stored. Suffolk Noga, Suffolk Loy Noga. And now it's uncertain whether the man touched the wine or didn't touch the wine. Rabbi Eliezer Oimel. So it's uncertain whether it's tar or tomei. So one thing is you're not allowed anymore to drink from the wine. But on the other hand, maybe it's still tar. Maybe it's still pure. Maybe it wasn't contaminated. So we don't know its situation. It's an uncertain. In Yiddish, once again, nishtahin, nishtaher, neither here nor there. Rabbi Eliezer Oimel, im ha'isem unachas b'mokim hatarufa. If it was lying in an exposed area, where if left there, it will most certainly become definitely Tomadika wine, Tomadika Tuma. In other words, it will definitely become Tuma, okay? So this Teruma is out in the open. This Trumadika wine is out in the open. It was pulled out into the open. So now we're not sure if the person touched it or not. So we're saying if it was out in the open, we're almost indefinitely, the person will come back and touch it. Or a sheretz will fall into it. So Rabbi Eliezer says, you have to place this truma wine, which is now uncertain. You got to place it in a concealed area. And if it's uncovered, you got to cover it. Because Rabbi Eliezer holds that the halacha that you still have to watch mishmeres trumasai, that you still have to watch the truma, still applies. It's true. You cannot any longer drink from this wine. Nonetheless, because I'm not sure that it's absolutely tameh, it still might be tar. I still have a job of watching it that it does not become definite tameh. Because as long as the truma is not definite tameh, I still have a job to watch mishmeres tumrase, to watch the truma. So if it's in an open area, we're almost definitely it's going to become vadai tuma. It's got a good chance of becoming vadai tuma. Go ahead and hide it and cover it. Rabbi Yeshua says just the opposite. If it's in a concealed place, do just the opposite. You're allowed to place it in an open area. And if it's covered, yigaleno, go ahead and uncover it. Because Rabbi Yeshua says, because it's uncertain whether it's tamei or tar, I'm not allowed to eat and drink from it anymore. If I'm not allowed to drink from it anymore, or I'm not allowed to eat from it if it's food, therefore the halacha of mishmeres trumasi no longer applies. The moment I no longer can have what he calls it, that I can no longer eat from it, it no longer applies. In that case, go ahead and put it in a place where it could definitely become definitely tumah. So we take it out of its uncertainty, let's make it tumah. So perhaps you could say the same thing over here by Rameya, that since the chametz of teruma is now on Erev Pesach standing to be burned, it's oimid lisroif, it's standing to be burned. So even if it's definitely tar, since it's standing to already be destroyed, it could go ahead, according to Rabbi Yeshua, and put it together with a definite tameh, with the chametz that's definitely tameh, and you could burn them together, right? Zakti Gemara, midami. It's not a good analogy. Wholesome in the case of the wine that got now an uncertain status. Wholesome gromad be'alma. It's only a groma, which in the article says a causative act. What is a groma? Means I don't do it with my hand. All I'm doing, according to Rabbi Yeshua, is I'm taking this barrel of wine, which is uncertain whether it's tar or tameh, and moving it to the middle of the room, moving it to the thing and uncovering it. That's all I'm doing. Now, if a tameh man doesn't walk in, it's not going to become tameh. If a sheretz doesn't come flying in and touch it, right? It's not going to become tamei. All I'm doing is pushing it into the middle. I'm making it possible. It's a groma. It's a causative. It's not the actual act. But by our case of chametz, I am picking hobby and dayim. Over here, I am going ahead and with my own hands taking the tar dika chametz dika cheruma and placing it in the fire together with the chametz dika, the chametz dika, the tomid dika chametz dika cheruma. So here I'm doing it with my hand. So it's not analogous. Maybe where all I'm doing is a grama, causative act. Maybe it will become tamei, definite tamei. Maybe it won't become definite tamei. That's not in my hand. Rabbi Yeshua says you're allowed to do that when it's uncertain because we no longer have a mitzvah of mishmeres terumasi, that I have to watch it because I no longer can eat it. But in this case, it's true we're about to burn the chametz. So I no longer maybe don't either have the rule of Ashmeres Terumasi. That doesn't say that I'm allowed to, with my own hand, go ahead and put them together. There's a big difference between a groma and doing it in your own hand, which, by the way, tangentially, that when we get to the Nezikin, monetary mesechtes, this is going to be a major thing. Groma ben Izaka and is chayev or potter. Somebody who's only a causative act, that from his act down the road, negligence happens. Is he responsible? Is he not responsible? And it's a big argument of how, when is it? Obviously, if you're negligence with your own hand, you're definitely responsible. If you only do a causative act, are you responsible? You're not responsible. That's exactly what this situation is over here by the Truma. So
Good question.
Good analogies. Let's go to the next case. Charlie, you okay? Got a question?
Yeah. Just is it the same grama as mitzvah say shazman grama?
Okay, so that's a little different. Mitzvah say shazman grama. That means what that really, if you translate, that means a positive commandment that the time causes. So in some ways it is, meaning, for an example, the morning comes. Now it's the time for saying Kriya Shema. You have to say Kriya Shema before 9 o'clock. So the time has caused you now to have a mitzvah, say, a positive commandment. It's up to you, however, to say Kriya Shema.
Right. So it's the same word, though.
It's the same word, but in halacha, the better example is what's going to come up with negligence. Negligence done by hand, you're definitely responsible. The other way, you're not. So now we're up to over here. Elahar Rabbi Yeshua. So what case of Rabbi Yeshua might be more analogous? It's not. So this is the case. We have a wine press. In this wine press, there are two vats, one on top, one on the bottom. The reason for that is the one on top is holding teruma, wine. The bottom vat is holding chulin wine. Not only is it chulin wine, regular non-sacred wine, but in fact, it's tomadik. It's completely contaminated because chulin is allowed to be eaten, even if it's contaminated. We don't have a problem. We only worry about tomei when it comes to truma and kachim, when it comes to truma and holy meat and holy food. So obviously they need to be separated because if the truma touches the chulin, two things happen. The truma is no good, can no longer be eaten because it just became tomei, right? And number two, the chulin won't be able to be drunk because it will have been touched by truma, and the chulin that's touched by truma becomes problematic because only a kohen is allowed to eat truma. So guess what happens over here? So you have two different vats. One on top is truma, the one on bottom is tomadik chulin. The case is chavis shel truma shenishbra begaso elyon. The top, the vat, the cask of truma, the truma of wine breaks. It springs a leak. And now the tachtoina chulin tamein, and the vat underneath, the cask underneath, call it what you want, the lower reservoir, according to the art scroll, is chulin tamei. So what's happening over here? That means, unfortunately, all this truma wine is pouring down the sides of the cracked vat, and it's about to flow into the chulin, tomadika chulin wine, which means we're looking at a complete disaster here. The truma is going to become tamei, which means you're going to have to burn it, And two, the chulin is going to become completely useless. You're not going to be able to drink or sell any of that wine because it's going to get mixed with truma. We're looking at a complete financial disaster. Moide Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. So Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua say, She'im yochel lahatzel mimenu revius b'tahara, if you're able to run to the kitchen and you're able to find a utensil, a keli, a vessel that is tahar, a tar-dik vessel, and you're able to run back to the vat, and you're able to stick this vessel underneath the vat that's cracked, so that you'll be able to save even a revius, that means just one kais, one cup of the pure kosher teruma wine, do so. Yatzel, save it. Even though at the cost of all the rest of the truma, obviously falling straight down into the chulin, tamid chulin, which will mean that the tamid chulin is now no good, it can't be sold, and the truma, of course, is gone, but at least you will have saved one little bit, which means you will have been mekayim to the best of your ability, mishmarti trumasi. I have watched your truma. That's what I've done. Well, what happens in Lav? You run to the kitchen, and there's this huge vessel. You got it. It's a huge vessel. And you run. The only problem is there's a big sign on the bottom of it that says, Tomei. It's Tomei. So now the huge vessel is Tomei. Okay? The huge vessel is Tomei. So now we've got a problem. I take this vessel, and I put it underneath the broken truma of wine, the vat. Right? The broken truma vat, wine vat. What am I doing this way? You say, at least this way, I can catch all the truma. And that means the wine on the bottom, the chulin wine that's tamei, will still be able to be sold in the marketplace because no truma will have fallen into it. But by me taking a tamei, a contaminated vessel to catch the truma, I am making all the truma tamei. I am, with my own hand, I'm making all the truma tamei because it's now going to fall into the vessel that I'm holding, the tamei dika vessel that I'm holding underneath all this wine. Yeah, but on the other hand, if you don't have the vessel, all the wine is anyways going to become tamei because it's going to fall into the chulin vat, right? Does that make sense? So, therefore, the question is what to do. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Tered v'sitame, you do nothing. Better to let the truma fall, all of it into the chulin, tamei dika chulin. And even though that means the truma will now be tamei, will have to be burnt, and the chulin will be a complete financial loss. It doesn't matter because the al yitamna biyad. Don't go ahead and be metama the truma, even though inevitably the truma is going to become tamei. Better to let the truma become tamei by itself than you go ahead and by your own hand make it tamei. It's the same thing. It doesn't matter. You have a mitzvah of mishmar terasi. You don't make it tamei. Let it become tamei by itself. It's going to be a complete financial loss. Tough noogies. Rabbi Yeshua, not absolutely not. Af yitama biyad. Even you can certainly contaminate the truma with your own hand, because since the truma will inevitably become tamei by raining into the bottom vat, if it's oimed to become tamei, it already is tamei for all intents and purposes. So what you're going ahead and putting it over here, putting the tamei vessel underneath to catch it, at the very least, you'll save the chulin. You're not really doing anything to the truma. You're not really doing anything to the truma because it's standing here to become tamei anyways. And at least you'll save the chulin. So now it's analogous to our case. Same thing, since the chametz has to be burnt anyways, so the tar dicker truma chametz is standing to be destroyed. It's standing to be destroyed. Guess what? So if you put it together with the tamei chametz, it's perfectly fine. Just like this case, this wonderful case of the two vats, according to Rabbi Yeshua. So the Gemara then says, I got a little problem with the language. Rabbi Rameya said from their words, it should have said from his words. Zakti Gemara, from the dispute of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, we learn that just like Rabbi Yeshua says over here, you're allowed to catch the true man. You yourself are allowed to make it tamei because it's inevitably it's going to get tamei anyways by falling into the tamei, the chulin, by the chomet. Since it's standing to be burnt anyways and destroyed anyways, since that even so, you could destroy it together with the chomet. Rashi says one of these words interesting. Rashi, it's about 15 lines to the bottom. Because the halacha is always like Rabbi Yeshua and not like Rabbi Eliezer, like Taharos, when we're dealing with situations of Tahara, like purity. Nothing new because the Rabbanan came along and voted against Rabbi Eliezer that we will never hold like him in Taharos. Because of the famous story of the oven of Achnoi B'Mitzia. Jeffrey knows this story very well. This is the famous story where there was a tanner, there was an oven, and there was an argument whether the oven is still pure or it became tamed. All the Chachamim said it was tamed. Rabbi Eliezer said it is tar. And Rabbi Eliezer, the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer brought all the proofs in the world that it was right, that it was tar, it was still pure. And the Chachamim wouldn't listen to him. So this is the famous story. Rabbi Eliezer said, if I'm right, let the boxer tree move 100 feet and the boxer tree at the top and moved 100 feet. He said, if I'm right, let the water flow backwards and it flow backwards. He said, if I'm right, let the walls of the shul start caving in. So the wall caved in halfway, right? Because of his honor and the honor of Rabbi Yeshua, the same Rabbi Yeshua that's here. And so finally he said, if I'm right, let heaven testify. And heaven came out with Pascal and said, why are you starting up on my son Eliezer, who's always right in everything? And then Rabbi Yeshua got up on his leg. He stood up on his legs in the poetic language of the Gemara, and it's pointed at heaven and said, the Torah is no longer in heaven. Torah leiba shemayim. You gave us the Torah on Har Sinai, and in your Torah you wrote, Achrei Rabim Lahatais. After the majority you shall follow. We are the majority. Rabbi Eliezer is only one. You, God, who just testified Rabbi Eliezer is right, are also only one. So you guys only have 2 votes, Hashem and Rabbi Eliezer. We are more. So the halacha is like us, that it's still tameh. Rab Nachman bangs it to Rabbi Eliezer, bangs it to Eliyahu Hanavi a little later and says, what was God doing at the time of this argument? And Eliyahu Hanavi says, Hashem was laughing and saying, my children have defeated me, my children have defeated me. In fact, in halacha, we actually paskin that it is tameh, and we do not paskin like Rabbi Eliezer and Hashem. It's Hashem, that doesn't matter. The bottom line is the Torah was given to us. Achrei Rabim Lahatas. Now, it happens to be that Rabbi Eliezer also knew that it was Achrei Rabim Lahatas after the majority, but he had a different definition of what a majority is. Rabbi Yeshua said a majority is you count heads, whoever has the majority. Rabbi Eliezer was from the school of Shammai. Shammai, everybody agreed, was Mechadete Tfei, was the brisk of their day. Hillel was the mir of their day. Hillel had a lot more students. Shammai was the Harvard of yeshivas. And so Rabbi Eliezer held, like the rest of Shammai, and the Gemara calls them Mechadete Tvei. They were the more sharper heads. He said, what do you think going after the majority is? It doesn't mean you count heads. It means you go, who's smarter? We're smarter, right? Therefore, the halacha should be like us. But of course, we don't pass it that way. So Rashi over here says that's what's going on over here in our Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua Lamadatu, that from the Gemara over there, that famous Gemara Baba Mitzvah, that we only paskin like Rabbi Yeshua by Taharis and not Rabbi Eliezer, so we paskin like him over here. That just like you're allowed to physically take a vessel and send and capture the truma wine in order to protect the tamei chulin, same thing over here. You can do it because we have to burn the chametz anyways. Dekanami. And you precise reading of the Mishnah tells us this is the case. Diktani, Moed Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rameir says it doesn't connotate, it's not analogous. And Moed Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, that you have to have 2 separate fires, right? Shema Mina, that obviously that Rameir, who Rabbi Yosef is coming to rebut must have been talking in Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. So now the Gemara says, "V'chein Omer Rav Nachman Omer Rabba Bar Ravua Masnisim Ba'ava Tuma D'Oraisa Uvelad Tuma D'Oraisa." Yes, Rabbi Chanina Ganim is talking about the first piece of meat. The first piece of meat was Matama on a Rishon, was a first level Tuma, Umay Devreim, and the second piece of meat was either a Sheni, a Shlishi, or Revi, a second, a third, or a fourth. Biblically, Umay Devreim, B'divrei Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua. Just like we said. Right, the Gemara, Eisvei Rabba, Rav Nachman, Amar Rabbi Yosef, Ein Hanidin Doimel Lira. The subject of Rabbi Yosef then turned to Rav Meir and said the subject under discussion of burning the tar chametz of teruma together with the tummy chametz of teruma is not analogous. Shehidu Aviseinu when our Rebbeim testified about what took place in the Beis Hamikdash. Amayidu, and what did they testify? If you're going to say we're talking about meat that became tame on a second, third, or fourth level, that's burned together with the meat that's on a first level that was mitama because it touched an avatuma. But that doesn't cute. It doesn't equate. Zet tame v'zet tame. In the Mishnah, then you're dealing with meat that's on a first level and meat that's either on a second or third level. So that's tame to tame. Here, one of the levels, one of the trumas is completely tar. When the ones that you want to burn on Erev Pesach. If you want to take the case of Rabbi Akiva, where the shemen of truma was touched by a tful yom and became a shalishi, meaning it became a psul. Shenifsal, it is tummy, but no longer convey tummy. Maglika noisid b'ner shenitma b'tumas meis, and it got lit in a lamp, a metal lamp that's on the level of an avatuma, because the metal, when touched by an avatuma, remains on an avatuma, so that the oil itself became a rishon l'tuma. Zeh pasul v'zeh tameh. It's still a case where both sides were tameh. Both sides were tameh. Just what? You're switching its label from a psul, from something that's tummy but cannot convey, to something that's possible that could convey. But our case is a clear-cut case of tahar truma of chametz and tamei truma of chametz. That's a different case. And af anumaydim, and we all agree, truma shenitmas, truma that is tamei completely, bivalada truma, the truma that's tamei as a second, third, or fourth, is allowed to be burned together with truma that was condemned by an avatuma. What do you call that? Can be burned with truma that was by an avat that's on a first level because they're both tumadik. But how can you burn uncertain truma that we're not certain whether it is tamei or tar? We're not sure if a person who was tamei touched it or not, together with definite tamei. Maybe Eliyahu will show up and tell us that this uncertain tamei is actually tahar and there's no way you could do it. And therefore, if madach, uncertain truma, we can't burn together with definite tamei, certainly tar dika truma certainly can't be burnt together with definite tamei. Amid Beis, 15b. And now the Gemara, this is just a continuation of the Brisa. It really doesn't have anything to do specifically with our case. Ha-pigul va'anoise va'tomei. What is pigul? Pigul is, as you know, every sacrifice has a time frame in which it needs to be eaten. Baboike, balayla, baboike, day, night, day, or just for a day and a night. If the person going ahead and doing the avodah, meaning shchita, kabbalah, halicha, zerika, the shechting of it, the accepting of the blood, carrying the blood, or sprinkling the blood, and during that period of time, he has in his head that I'm going to eat it after the time frame. If he has that in mind, while the meat remains tahar, pure, it has to be burnt. It's already ruined because in your mind you had a machsheves zarius, a wrong thought that you're going to eat it after the allotted time. Noisar is after the allotted time. There's still meat left over. That meat needs to be burnt. But that meat is also still biblically tahar, pure. The hatame, and meat that biblically became tamei was touched by a tameidik person. So we've got three different things that need to be burned, but two of them on pigel va'anoisa are really midioraisa. Pigel and noisa are always still tahar. Only midrabanon, because they wanted to keep the kahanim away from having the wrong thoughts or from leaving over the meat. They said if you touch pigel or noisa, the hands of the kohen become tamei, and they have to table their hands. It gets tumas yad midrabanan, not the rest of their body, only the tumas yad. But they have a tuma midrabanan of yad. You cannot burn them together because pigel and noisa at the end of the day are still biblically tahar. Tamei is absolutely biblically tamei. You can't mix the two of them together because you cannot deliberately be metamet tar diker basar. You can burn them together. You can burn them together because this one has, because at the very least it has some sort of tamei. It's only rabbinical and it's only yad tamei. It's enough. Since it has rabbinically, it has tamei. You can burn it together with the tamei. But either way, according to both of them, that is not analogous to our case of chametz. Because in chametz, the truma, one half is truma that is tahar. That is completely pure. That doesn't even have rabbinical tamei. So therefore, you cannot match it up. So, if you're going to say that Rabbi Meir was talking about Rabbi Yeshua, his case of the vat, of the two vats, the truma vat, the wine of truma, and the wine of chulin, then what is Rabbi Yossi trying to rebut him with the words of Rabbi Chanina Sagan Kahanim? He's not talking about Rabbi Chanina Sagan Kahanim. His proof comes from Rabbi Yeshua in the case of the two wine vats. So Zakti Gemara, Amalei Rabbi Nachman, Rabbi Yossi lav adate. Rabbi Yossi did not understand Rabbi Meir's intention. Rabbi Yossi, you need to always remember, got sick and unfortunately lost his memory. So he didn't always have it clear. The who saber Rabbi Meir, kid Rabbi Chanina, but it's Kahanim Kamalei. Rabbi Yossi thought that Rabbi Meir was bringing his proof that you're allowed to burn the two chametzes, the tar truma, together with the tamei truma, together on Erev Pesach from Rabbi Chanina Sagan Kahanim. Va'anan Amalei, and Rabbi Meir told him, Anan be Rabbi Yeshua Ka'amina. I'm actually deriving my law from Rabbi Yeshua. Va'amalei, and then Rabbi Yossi then rebutted him. Va'afilu Rabbi Yeshua nami ein min amida. But even if you're trying to compare it with Rabbi Yeshua, it's not analogous. Because the Hamayda Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, but both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua agree that by tar chametz truma and tamei chametz of truma, so Saif and Zubuk Neyatzma, you need two different fires. The tar chametz has to be burned in its own fire, and the tamei has to be burned in its own fire. Frank the Gemara, v'amai hu eina min amida mido mido. What are you talking about? I have Rabbi Yeshua from the cases of the wine vats, where he allowed me to go ahead and take a tamedika, a contaminated vessel, and trap the truma that was falling in order to save the chulin underneath. I was making the truma tamei by my own hand. He said since it was inevitable that the truma would become tamei anyways, because it was falling into the tamedika chulin. When it's inevitable, you're allowed to go ahead and do it, especially when you can save something else. So therefore, that's analogous to our case, because the chametz is, all chametz is now has to be burnt, is going to be destroyed. In that case, the truma that is tahar is still chametz. It needs to be destroyed. It's allowed to be destroyed together with the tamei dika truma. Zakti Gemara, no, because the case of the vat shani hasam, the ikka hefsid chulin. There's a hefsid merubah. There's a big loss coming. Since, regardless, the truma is going to become tamei. Either you're going to catch it in a tamei vessel, or it's going to fall into the chulin. Better to catch it in a tamei vessel and at least save the chulin, so that financially we don't have a complete loss, right? Masha'ekem by chametz, that's not the situation. So they're burning in two different fires. Maskav Rabbi Yimi, what do you mean it's not the same situation? Masnisanami, Ika Hepsid Eitzim. If I got to make two fires, it means I got to add wood. I got to have wood for one fire and wood for another fire. There were no matches in those days. So that meant you had to get wood. So I got to spend money on additional wood. So that's also a hefsid. Zok the Gemara, no. Amalei Ahu Saba, a certain grandfather, a certain elderly man said to Rabbi Yirmiyah, Lehepsid Meruba Chashashu, for a Hepsid Meruba, we are Chayshish, meaning on a big loss, we're going to go ahead and make some accommodations where the Truma inevitably was going to become Tameh anyways. I'm going to allow you to do it by hand and catch it in a Talmudic vessel. But on a small loss, I'm not allowing you to do that. Not allowing you to do it. By the way, Amalei Ahu Saba, a certain elderly man, Toisvis, top of Davov in Mesechtes Chulin. Mesechtes Chulin, 6a, the first Toisvis, says something remarkable that every time in Shas, except for one, every time it says Ahu Saba, it means Eliyahu Hanavi. Every time it says a certain grandfather, it meant Eliyahu came and whispered in somebody's ear. Tosfos on the top of 6a in Chulin. So let's go a little further, just to get a little further down the Yomi. Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Machlaikis B'Sheish. We can say the argument is only during the 6th hour. Remember, on the 6th hour of Erev Pesach, rabbinically, midrabanan, it becomes usher to deal with the chametz, and you have to dispose, you have to burn the chametz. Only rabbinically starts in the 7th hour, in the hour of the Korban Pesach. So rabbinically, there's an argument where Rameir says, even when rabbinically I have to return, I have to destroy the chametz, but biblically I'm still allowed to have the chametz. He says it's okay. If rabbinically you have to destroy, I'm allowing you to destroy the tar truma together with the tamei truma. And Rameir argues and says, no, you need 2 different fires. Abu b'sheva, but on the 7th Avenue, where biblically everybody agrees it needs to be destroyed. Divrei HaKol Sarfin. Everybody says once it's biblically, there's no more rule of washing the truma, and no problem, you can burn them together. In that case, since we're talking about the 6th hour and we're talking about rabbinical prohibition, back to what we started with. It's talking about one piece of meat is a rishon because it touched an abatoma. The other piece of meat is only a shalishi midrabanan, a shalishi midrabanan because it was touched by a vessel that was touched by tamidika, by contaminated liquids on a biblical basis, are not mitama utensils, but midrabanan they are mitama. So this shady became mitama on a shady rabbanan, and this utensil touches meat, which came a shalishi rabbanan. And by dint, it's going to bump up to a second chain, right? Because now, and we're saying, Umay Divrei, Medibri Rechanini Sagan Kahanim. And then Rameh is talking about Sagan Kahanim, because here's a case of we were allowing a rabbinical tummy to go from a 3rd to a 2nd. Same thing over here. Since the 6th hour, we're dealing with a rabbinical prohibition, and not a biblical prohibition, not a biblical prohibition of the 2nd hour. So now it gets she said, you're right, that's what it is. Rameh is talking in Rabbi Chaim according to this version. What it says in Navi, we're talking about one piece of meat was by an opportunity, the other piece is always touched by a vessel that was only Rabbanon. So it became a Rabbanon, a 3rd Tumah on a rabbinical level. Is only in the 6th hour, in the rabbinical hour. The biblical hour, the call surfing. So says the Gemara, let's bring proof to Rabbi Yochanan, because it says before, pigul and noisa, that means somebody had a machshavas zoris, somebody had a bad thought that he was going to eat the meat that's now being shafted after its time allotment. Va'noisa, meat that was left over in its time allotment. Va'atami, something that's actually tummy midiraisa. And again, pigul v'noisa only have tumah midirabanan, that if a kohen touches it, even though the tar midiraisa, but the Chazal didn't want the kohen to get into the idea of making pigul and noisa, so they made their hands tummy midirabanan. Beis Shammai Yomim ein nishabachas. You can't burn it together because on the biblical level, the bigel and nicer are tahar, and the tomei is big, and the other one is tomei. Beis Hillel Yomim nishabachas. They can be burned together because at the end of the day, it still has a rabbinical tomei, but that doesn't work in our case. It's not acknowledges because it's not analogous because at the end of the day, what do you call it? That actually, let me try to say. So right now, we want to say it is analogous because Rabbi Yossi is saying the same thing during the 7th hour when it's biblically the tar chametz can certainly be burnt, and in the 6th hour, what do you call it? That's Rameya that says that it could be burned. The same thing like over here, like Beis Hillel, that you're allowed it to burn because it's going to be destroyed anyways. It's like it has a tummy. It's fine. So the Gemara Shani Asim. No, Pigel and Nosh are different. That's what we just said. The Islay Tumah Midirabana. All they have is Tumah Dirabana. The Ta'an Pigel v'Noisim Etamin is Yadayim. Pigel and Nosh, even though biblically are tar, the Rabbanan said they metama, they may contaminate the hands of the Kohanim. So this is no good. Mashe came to what kind of proof can you bring to chametz? The chametz, which on the truma, which is tahar, there is no tummy. How could I say even on the rabbinical hour that I could burn them together? So the Gemara goes a little further, and then we're going to stop. Lema Messiah, should we say hapas shebi ifsha, the case of bread that became moldy, and it's no longer fit for human consumption. It's disgusting. But a dog will eat it. So the Gemara says an interesting thing. If a dog will still eat it, it still has the power. It is subject to become tummy, to be contaminated, as long as it's the measure of an egg, of an egg, the size of an egg. But it's allowed if this moldy piece of bread is truma, it's allowed to be burned together with tamei dik and truma on erev Pesach, even though it's tar. This is reflecting Rabbi Yossi, because Rameir allows us to burn. Rameir allows us to burn edible chametz, tar, together with edible chametz that's tamei, right? Rabbi Yossi says only in the 7th hour am I allowed to burn. In the biblical hour, am I allowed to burn tar truma together with tamei truma, which means, but in the 6th hour, I'm not allowed to burn tar truma with tamei truma. But moldy bread that's not worthy, is unfit for human consumption, he would agree that you're allowed to burn it, and even in the 6th hour. Shani Hassan says, no, the Afra Balu, this moldy bread, you're right. In halacha, it still could become tamei on if it's the size of an egg. But as regard to teruma, by becoming moldy, it loses its name, shem teruma. It's no longer teruma, which means it's just simply a tamei. It's simply a moldy piece of bread. Simple chulindik, a moldy piece of bread, could be burnt with the regular chametz in one fire. So now this is where we are. We are now at the bottom of Tezvav Amud Beis. I hope everybody is not too confused.